Katharina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katharina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review. This is Chris Driscoll, and along with me is Rainer Shea, our co-host. And the theme of tonight, the major kind of theme that I picked out was Frederick Engels at 200. It's Frederick Engels' 200th birthday this past Saturday. And there's been a lot of response, surprisingly, so I'm going to go over some of that, go over some of the highlights of Engels' contribution to Marxism. You really have to say that he was the co-creator of Marxism. It could just as easily have been called Engelsism as Marxism, in my opinion. Because of the important contributions that Frederick Engels made to that. So that's going to be the start off tonight. But before we get to that, how are you doing, Rainer Shea?
Let's see. I don't know what that question means. How are you doing? I never know what it means. But I am thinking of Engels as it relates to this issue, and it seems like Engels is the unsung hero of Marxism to a great extent. And I read Lenin's The State of Revolution, which seems to quote him half the time.
Yeah, well, because he wrote that stupendous book, which I found highly valuable, Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, where he laid out the Marxist theory of state. So Lenin was guided by that when he wrote his State and Revolution. Those two books together are extremely important for any Marxist or Marxist-Leninist or anyone who lays claim to learning from Marxism. You're very right in that. But the question is just open-ended. It's what's on your mind? Is there anything that you want to start off with talking before we jump into our agenda? I want to lock you in right at the beginning.
I was just thinking of the propaganda strategy for the war in Syria, which stems from the classic neo-colonial strategy of using humanitarianism and selective types of aid to gain control over a territory. And even though the West hasn't been able to win the war in Syria, it's been able to use front groups like the White Helmets and stories from war refugees whose accounts have been heavily slanted, but through Western media portrayals like Bana al-Abed, to advance narratives. Half the war has been narrative.
Yes, absolutely. It's a real fundamental of imperialism, I guess, and they're definitely exhibiting that in Syria. Okay, well, should we launch into the first topic? The return to Engels, Marx's general at 200. And this, just want to give a few of my impressions of Engels and relate to you a few of the reasons that I think that Engels is so fundamentally important to the foundation of Marxism, why he was so influential in his life and influential in all of the socialist movements that began or sprung up out of Marx and Engels' work and their work at providing a scientific backbone, scientific skeletal structure for socialism, which didn't really have much of a scientific or analytical foundation before Marx and Engels came along. It was more like a gut thing, and I'm sure you've known in your life, you've known gut socialists. What I call gut socialists is people who come to socialist ideas just out of their gut, not so much out of their brains, not out of their thinking process. And that's the way that's the way socialism was prior to Marx and Engels' emergence on the world stage. Engels was born on November 28th, 1820. So exactly 200 years ago, I guess 200 years and 2 days now. So, it was 200 years ago that Engels came to the world, came to us. He was 2 years younger than Marx. He met Marx and slowly, over a period of about 4 years, became closer and closer to Marx during the 1840s. And then by 1848, especially, he and Marx were elected by the International Working Men's Association, which we Marxists often refer to as the First International. He was nominated by those people to write the Communist Manifesto, which was to be, or intended to be, the foundational document of their movement, a movement that gave them guidance. And of course, it's one of the biggest selling books. It's not that big of a book. Anybody can read it in a short while. but it's one of the biggest selling books of all times and still sells great amounts. You can get it for free, so it's still astounding that so many people buy it, but a lot of people like the feel of the paper, I guess. But it was of monumental importance to the growth of the socialist movement. And Engels and Marx, in that and a couple of other articles and books that they wrote during that time, they established what was maybe one of the most extraordinary intellectual partnerships of all time. They relied on each other tremendously. Now, Marx was an editor to begin with. He was more dedicated to, the writing and that kind of thing, even though Engels early on showed great promise as a writer. And he really was. He was a different kind of a writer than Marx. Marx was very, I'm trying to think of a good description of it, but Marx was very technical in nature, let's put it that way. And he homed in on really deep analysis, a technical analysis of his subject matter. Whereas Engels, he was more accessible as a writer. I think almost anybody would agree, reading Engels and reading Marx, that Engels is far easier to read. I mean, he's sometimes quite a pleasure to read, even though he's dealing with deep intellectual subjects. He really has a great way of presenting them. And he was much more of a popularizer. But everywhere is much an important thinker as well, an important crafter of the basic tenets of Marxism, especially of the methodology of Marxism, dialectical materialism and historical materialism, which Engels wrote a lot more about than Marx did. Marx, of course, was more focused on applying the method to economics, to history, to the subjects that he tried to tackle. Whereas Engels devoted part of his time to writing books specifically. Books like Anti-Dühring and the Dialectics of Nature, for example, are examples of books that in which Engels really excelled at explaining how this method, this Marxist method, worked. It's a method of thinking and a method of analyzing and understanding reality, really. Historical materialism basically focused on the social, cultural end of science, whereas dialectical materialism much broadly applies to all physics, the whole physical reality, the whole materialist reality, as Marx and Engels would have described it. So they were, both of them, extraordinary individuals, and they were an extraordinary team. Engels, for a good long period of his life, was less able to devote attention to being a writer than Marx and a researcher, because he ended up inheriting the family business, which was textiles, starting out in Germany. And his father had a factory in Manchester, England. And he ended up landing in Manchester and becoming the operator, the manager of the family business in Manchester. And the bad thing to Engels about that was that he's kind of stumbled through birth, into being a capitalist, and that's the opposite of what he wanted to be, what he thought of himself as, what his life was all about. But on the other hand, it gave him a lot of money that he was able to use to fund Marx's work, to enable Marx, who had children and a wife to take care of. And Marx, it isn't that just that Engels was Marx's only source of funding. I mean, he was a journalist, a working journalist, and he made money that way. He worked for many newspapers in Europe and in the United States, and he made money that way. However, and he made money off of his publishing as well. I mean, his works that were published along the way. However, he really did need Engels' help to be able to live the kind of comfortable middle-class life that he was able to lead, that gave him the emotional or psychological comfort to know that his wife and his kids were all right. They were taken care of. They weren't starving, because there were times early on in Marx's life where his kids and his wife were close to great hunger and living hand to mouth and really desperate. So Engels played a big part in kind of helping Marx get his financial house in order so that he could devote full time to his great work, especially to his writing of Das Kapital, which he did during the 1860s to a large part. In any case, Engels was very instrumental in that. Engels was a polyglot, really, in subjects. I mean, he wrote about science, mathematics, sociology. He's credited with helping to found whole schools of academia, for that matter. He, as I already mentioned, he was a great expositor of the Marxist method and of Marxism more generally, a great popularizer of all of that kind of stuff. So he really was extremely important to our movement, and I'm real happy that at this opportunity of his 200th birthday that we can take a chance. And I also say that a lot of other people have been doing this, especially over this weekend. I picked out, I don't know, a couple dozen articles at least that I'm going to try to mention along the way here. So let me stop there for a time and let you, Rainer, respond.
Marx and Engels formulated this this political theory that was really science, or they were political and economic scientists who drew upon what they saw, and this is really all that they did. They weren't creating some kind of religion, as the critics of Marxism accuse Marxism of being. You might have seen how this guy Russell Means says that he said that Marxism is utterly alien to native culture, but this is kind of a vapid and misleading criticism, because you could be someone from anywhere in any culture and look at the developments of capitalism and the developments of history, and discover this stuff for yourself. And this, it's not like this was like Marxism was only applicable to Europe. Thomas Edison, no, what am I saying? Thomas Edison, you should be skeptical of him. Nikola Tesla, there could be a Nikola Tesla in every continent, every culture.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Moving right along, topic number 2, Engels in his own words. I've just in this, I'm just going to name off some of Engels' most important books and recommend them. I've mentioned 2 of them, actually. 2 of the first 3, or 4 of the first 3 I've already mentioned, or 5 maybe. The first I would put up there is the Communist Manifesto. You know what I noticed? I don't even have the condition. Oh no, here it is. The Conditions of the Working Class in England, which was one of his earliest, I think it might have been his earliest book, published in 1845 or something like that, but it's an extraordinary book. It establishes the whole sociology of urban life. It's quite an incredible book, very influential. And then, of course, there was a Communist Manifesto, which I've already spoken of. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which really, in my opinion, at least in my life, it had a huge impact. Almost all of these books had a huge impact in my life, I got to tell you. I've been a great admirer of Engels for decades and decades. But Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific explains the difference between the Marxist idea of socialism as a scientific approach towards social and economic and history kinds of topics, in contrast to what Marx and Engels called the Utopian socialism, which was basically originally more the socialists who believed in building co-ops, like the great cooperativists of the late 18th century and early 19th century. And not that there was anything bad about them or terrible about them, but they did not really develop a whole scientific approach towards building socialism, towards analysis of society, analysis of the economy, analysis of history. And then there was, I also mentioned earlier, the origin of the family, private property, and the state. I already spoke a bit about this, but another book that had a great impact on me. First of all, the origin of the family, he really gets in the beginning, he gets into a lot of the Marx and Engels thinking about human development in prehistoric society, human development coming up from there, which I found fascinating. And it actually led me, when I finally did go to college in my late 30s, it led me to study archaeology and anthropology as one of the subjects, besides journalism, which was my major. But those were 2 of the subjects that I also studied a great deal in university, as well as the philosophy of science, which Engels was also, I think, instrumental in influencing me to go in that direction. Another one is commonly called Anti-Dühring. Dühring was a philosopher that Engels was contrasting his and Marx's ideas with. And it's also about general topics of philosophy and about Marxist method. And then there's Dialectics of Nature, 1883, where Engels deals with the Marxist method, applying it to nature, to physics, to biology, to the what are called the hard sciences. That's also a great book. This is not a book, it's an article, but it's called The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, which he wrote in 1876. Also a fascinating story about the role that work, people crafting things, the role that played in our evolution. The condition of the working class in England, I already mentioned. Peasant War in Germany, fascinating subject because it gets into the kind of Middle Ages socialist movements. And then there's a history of Ireland. Being an Irishman myself, I was really enjoyed reading History of Ireland, Natural Conditions, Ancient Ireland, from the preparatory material for the History of Ireland by Frederick Engels, which is an article, long article, but it was always intended by Engels to be a book, which he never got to write. So I kind of wish he had been able to do that. So those are just some of the books I wanted to mention, and gives you an idea of the broad kinds of subject matter that Engels dealt with. And then there's a couple of articles that, I mean, as I said, I picked out about 24 articles that different people have written. I found my favorite economist, Michael Roberts. He has a new book out that was just released on Saturday in commemoration of Engels' 200th birthday, that is about Frederick Engels, his life, and about his economics work. The writing that Engels did on economic subjects, which I'm really looking forward to reading. I've already kind of perused it and looks really good. But there are also just dozens of articles. I'm going to just mention a couple of them before I stop here. Let me get it up if I can find it. Here it is. Let me see here. We have, the Monthly Review Press, which I think they're at monthlyreviewpress.org. And there's an article by Paul Blackledge called Engels versus Marx, 200 Years of Frederick Marx. And this article, just to make a long story short, this article is about the attempts by social democrats, reformists, people like that, and by enemies of socialism, the attempts to distance Marx from Engels and Engels from Marx in our minds, to try to drive a wedge between them, to create huge differences between Marx and Engels that don't really exist, because Marx and Engels were incredibly close. I mean, closer than you could imagine, I think, two best friends being best friends and political collaborators. So it's a great article. I highly recommend it. It was published on May 1st, 2020. So you can look on Monthly Review Press for that. There was even an article in The Guardian, which was quite good. It was by Tristan Hunt, who is a biographer of Engels. I think he's kind of a right-wing social democrat in Britain in a lot of ways, but apparently his biographies he's written more than one, but his biographies of Engels are quite good. And anyway, he had a really fascinating article in The Guardian about Engels' 200th birthday and the impact that Engels had. Let me see if we can find any others. There was, oh yeah, maybe I have skipped over it somewhere here. Well, there's also in The Observer, Engels comes of age, the socialist who wanted a joyous life for everyone. Oh no, that's the Tristan Hunt article. Sorry about that. There was another one that I was trying to find here. Let me see if I can find it before I leave this topic, because I thought it was pretty important. Just a second. Well, I can't find it. And, it's too bad because it was an article about the let's see if I can reconstruct it in my brain. But it was an article about reformism versus revolutionary socialism, and the attempt by social democrats for over the last 70 or 80 years to claim that Engels was not really a revolutionary socialist, that he became a reformist socialist, and that he was especially after Marx's death, that he became really a leader of reformism. In fact, that's utterly a lie. It's not true at all. And there's a lot of good evidence for that fact. But this article that I was just trying to raise is about that whole subject, and just a defense of Engels' revolutionary communist nature, and his defense of revolution and condemnation of his condemnation of reformism. So there was that. Anyway, there were articles from the Communist Party USA, from the Left Voice, from Liberation, the newspaper of the PSL, from the China Daily, the newspaper of the Communist Party. 200 Candles for Engels, a man who helped shape history. The Communist Party of China has published an illustrated biography of Engels. So there was that. Here, anyway, I found it. This publication called Left Voice. You can look that up on in a search engine. Left Voice, 2 words. Engels Against Reformism in Germany and France is the name of it. And it was quite a good article talking about that aspect of Engels. Engels has had to go through one of the articles in the Monthly Review was also in defense of Marx, because there have been so many of these phony Marxians, these fake socialists who attempt to divide Marx and Engels when, in fact, they were the closest collaboration a person could imagine having on an intellectual subject. So, couple of articles that were interesting in that way. Also, there was an article in Monthly Review Press by what's the name, Bellamy Foster, about Engels' application of Marxism to the understanding of nature and how that informs ecological thinking and the environmental movement, which that's an aspect of Engels that I had never considered before. So I recommend that pretty highly too. So there we have it. I'll leave it there. What are your thoughts?
This is an interesting phenomenon within that phenomenon that you describe in terms of these revisionist strains, where they try to make a case seemingly for their own brand of socialism, if you can call it socialism, by trying to create this narrative where Marx and Engels were fundamentally at odds. And it kind of reminds me of the effort by Trotskyists to paint Stalin and Lenin as fundamentally at odds, and to paint Marxism as fundamentally at odds with Juche. So this seems like a trend among those who seek to delegitimize like revolutionary socialism, and especially actually existing socialism. They tend to try to paint the figures within these movements and these different theorists as in conflict with each other, maybe to give the impression that it's all just incoherent. It seems like their goal with painting Engels as a reformist is to give credence to the kind of Kautskyite ideas that these reformists espouse. If you've read The State and Revolution, you certainly know about how Kautsky was one of the earlier figures who tried to distort Marxism and portray it as something that calls for, like, what was he even thinking, that you could establish socialism by trying to vote it in through a bourgeois parliamentary system?
Yeah, I would say with Kautsky that he was one of the later people to come to that, because to come to reformism, because he was not a reformist early on. He was very revolutionary, because he was under Engels' tutelage and under Marx's tutelage, for that matter. And for a long time, very committed to revolutionary socialism. But I think it was mainly at the beginning of the war, World War I, as we call it, the Great War, the war to end all wars, as some people call it, where he betrayed everything that he knew Marxism was about. And he knew that because he was a great popularizer of these ideas. So, I always fear that people will, read Lenin's responses in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, or in the late teens to Kautsky, and reject everything about Kautsky, and that would be a huge mistake, because Kautsky is a lot of Kautsky's work is highly valuable.
So then thanks for giving me more context. I was one of those
That's
people.
not to say that he wasn't a renegade, because he was. He was a goddamn turncoat. He's just late. He was a late bloomer as a reformist, as opposed to somebody like Bernstein, who started the ball rolling in the late 1890s. So, anything else on that?
No.
Okay. Next on the list is something from Rainer Shea, and it is called "We Can't Vote Our Way Out of Neoliberalism." True that.
This is the point we were just making, that you can't vote your way into socialism. Well, to be fair, these social democrats don't exactly want socialism. What they seem to want is an improved version of capitalism, and implicitly an improved version of imperialism, which they kind of sweep under the rug when they espouse their ideas. The kind of rhetoric that's being used by commentators, social democrat commentators like Kyle Kulinski, whose videos I've been watching a lot of lately because he's objectively a pretty entertaining political commentator, is advocating for a new deal and discussing the ways that the New Deal of the 1930s improved the living standards of the American proletariat. But what these kinds of discussions from the Social Democrats leave out is the fact that the New Deal pretty much only benefited the favored settler white class, while helping reinforce the Jim Crow system, which was essentially the America's apartheid system. And it was also designed to solidify the oppression of nationalities like the Puerto Ricans and the indigenous peoples. And it was tied in with the campaign to use World War II to fortify U.S. imperialism and grab up geopolitical control and improve the conditions for the favored parts of the U.S. population through means of war and conquest, and for reinforcing apartheid too. I mean, this is the other side to this whole history that the Social Democrats are so eager to discuss. And of course, they could argue that the same wouldn't be the case if there were an equivalent of an FDR today. Like this is what these Social Democrats say their ideal president would be: a new FDR. But the thing is, just because Jim Crow isn't around anymore, it doesn't mean a new FDR wouldn't perpetuate so many of the things that FDR perpetuated. It doesn't mean that a new FDR wouldn't perpetuate imperialism and strengthen the whole settler colonial apparatus. I mean, in the last 4 years or so, the Social Democrats in the U.S. have upheld Bernie Sanders, a politician who's been so-so on Palestine, to put it lightly. At times, Sanders has really conceded to the Israeli state's efforts to legitimize its colonial violence against the Palestinians. And of course, Sanders doesn't support the decolonization of Palestine. He just supports the two-state solution, which is neither viable nor moral. And of course, there have been all these pro-imperialist policies that Sanders has backed over the decades, like the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia, and all of these votes to fund the military and the U.S. efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in recent years, one of Sanders's bills has helped perpetuate Trump's drone war in Yemen, because Sanders has said himself that he doesn't oppose the drone war. So these are the kinds of contradictions that inevitably come up when you're looking at the records of Democratic politicians. Even the beloved AOC has conceded to the imperialists in many ways, like declining to oppose the U.S. Venezuela regime change effort and meeting with some people who were associated with the Bolivian coup last November, and in the first few weeks of AOC's term, she was one of the Congress people who voted for the Defend NATO Act. Might have been the Preserve NATO Act, but there was a pro-NATO bill that was put to a vote in January 2019, and AOC and all the rest, these other Democrats voted for it shortly before Trump's administration started off its coup effort around that time. And it's important to mention these things because they're illustrative of the ways that social democrats don't fundamentally oppose imperialism, the fact that these social democrats don't oppose imperialism speaks to how the system can very easily co-opt these supposedly radical progressive politicians. This is what we've seen in New Zealand, where there's been this prime minister who has been hailed by the international media as exceptionally progressive and even social democratic, but has really perpetuated New Zealand's participation in neoliberalism, austerity, anti-immigration policies, and the build-up towards war. It's not like these social democrats in America or the UK will ever be able to come to power, because the system, as we've seen in recent years, can very easily sabotage their electoral hopes. We saw this in 2016 with the rigging of the primary. We saw this in 2019 with the rigging of the UK election that forced Corbyn out. We've seen this in 2020 with the latest rigging of the primary that forced Sanders to end his campaign early. And the ruling class perpetrates these electoral manipulations against social democratic candidates because in the 21st century, the conditions of capitalism aren't compatible with the 21st century welfare state. The crisis of capitalism has escalated to a point where neoliberalism, with its austere and upward redistribution of wealth oriented system, is the only way that capitalism can continue to function. The only way that capitalism can continue to function is to foist the burdens of our crises onto the lower classes while redistributing wealth upward. So naturally, the ruling class has rejected all of these electoral attempts by the social democrats to gain power and to institute reforms as reasonable as Medicare for all. From the perspective of the ruling class, even Medicare for all is unreasonable because it goes against the neoliberal hegemony. And the neoliberal hegemony is the only option for capitalism. Margaret Thatcher said it. There is no alternative. And this applies today more than ever. So we really can't expect for a social democrat to win the presidency in 2024, 2028, or any time later. Our only option is to overthrow the capitalist state and replace it with a proletarian run state.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking about this as you were talking about the Prime Minister of New Zealand. The Labour Party has been very strong in New Zealand, and like all Anglosphere countries, this comes from the tradition of Great Britain. But like all others, including the United States, New Zealand up until the 90s had a two-party system that kind of forces two parties, or it forces out all the other parties. The two parties become dominant. And the Labour Party there was one of the two dominant parties. And they had a big change in 1992. They went over to a proportional representation system, which opens things up for third parties to come in. But astoundingly, the Labour Party has still remained very strong. It just shows the great power that a political party that's affiliated directly with labor unions has in that kind of a system. But when it became a proportional representation system, the Labour Party still dominated, and this woman you're talking about is Labour Party PM. And like in all Anglosphere countries with social democrat parties, which is every single one except the United States, the Social Democrats, mostly called labor parties, but they're Social Democrats really, in ideology. Those labor parties have always been supporters of imperialism, going back to World War I and the big debate in the global socialist movement that split the socialist movement into two wings, into the communist and the socialist wing, or communist and social democrat wings. Even going back to that time, the labor parties in the Anglosphere part of the world were always strongly supportive of their own bourgeoisies in imperialist policy, in imperial policy. So it should not surprise anyone that this current Labour Party PM in New Zealand is exactly the same way and is following the tradition of all Anglosphere social democrat parties, labor parties. Usually they're called labor parties. I think in all Anglosphere countries they're called labor parties, except for in South Africa and in India. And India is not really part of the Anglosphere anymore, because when they got their independence, they became independent of the monarchy as well. They became a republic, whereas all these other Anglosphere countries did not do that, except for the United States way back when. Canada, for instance, has a queen. Her name is Elizabeth #2. New Zealand, Australia, they've all got that. But kind of an interesting aspect of social democracy. That's the whole thing that split social democracy in two and created the communist movement globally in the World War I, back more than 100 years ago now. So yeah, great article, by the way, very, very well done. And I give it high marks. So next on the list is topic number 4, and it is called America Doesn't Need Healing, It Needs Socialism. And I was immediately attracted by that title. And this article is by Margaret Kimberly. She is a editor, contributing editor with the Black Agenda Report, which people who follow our show will know we often give mention to the Black Agenda Report because of the great articles that come out of that publication. This particular article, oh, you know what? What am I thinking? This article is by Danny Haifong, not by Margaret Kimberly. And of course, Danny and Margaret do a video show together on YouTube. It's the Black Agenda Report's video show that I think they try to do it once a week, but don't always do that. But anyway, Danny is in this article getting into Biden's promise to return the United States to normalcy. You know, the idea that it comforts corporate executives in the gig economy, comforts Wall Street in the military-industrial complex, and how this normalcy, even though that's what the capitalist news media is calling for, the billionaire-owned news media, that's what they're calling for. You know, and they're calling for, you know, normalcy, reset. We've talked about this before on this show. What we really need is socialism. It's a great article by Danny. I'm not going to get into it more than that. It's published November 25, 2000, just a few days back. And you can find this on, let me see, I can never see this part. Let me see if I can expand this. Here we go. It's blackagendareport.com. So you can go there on your web browser and find it. The article is titled, "America Doesn't Need Healing, It Needs Socialism." I also got the chance to see Danny yesterday in a fabulous webinar that dealt with the subject of the American aggressions and hybrid warfare against China. And Danny and several other experts on China gave presentations. Danny's presentation was stupendous, as always. So I wish I had it right on the tip of my tongue, the name of that webinar, but it was maybe next week I'll mention it again so that people can refer back to that and watch the webinar. It was well worth getting into. But anyway, Rainer, what are your thoughts?
As we might discuss later, if you have decided to include my article about Biden's the coming Biden presidency, the agenda that Biden and his team have is one of making the American empire great again, and this will mean returning to the Obama era of multilateralism, and which will entail getting back to trade agreements like the TPP, even though China has messed up the ambitions for restoring the TPP, and this will internally involve creating a sense that America is experiencing a kind of healing, that the instabilities of the Trump era are being patched up. I mean, isn't this what they've been preparing for the whole time with Russiagate? Russiagate is it's really been a very interesting case study in narrative management, because it's not just been about these specific geopolitical narratives. It's been about culture. It's been about inculcating Americans, especially Democrats, with a strong desire to return to the Obama status quo of more hidden, polite imperialism. And this is why the Democrats and their aligned anti-Trump neocons have gone after Trump. They've accused Trump of being too soft on Russia, too soft on North Korea, too soft on Syria, on China. And this has, of course, encouraged Trump to push the U.S. even more towards world war. Will Biden and his team and the media outlets that align with Biden try to sell this narrative of a healing America? Biden's administration will carry out, they'll ramp up imperialism in certain respects. I mean, we really can't trust Biden to end the war in Yemen. We can't trust Biden to end the aggressions on Iran. And Biden's team has already expressed that they'll tighten sanctions on North Korea and close up a lot of the diplomatic moves that Trump had made towards the DPRK. Also, Biden's administration will carry out Obama-style coups in Latin America, which will mean campaigns of political interference in countries like Brazil and Chile that are branded as anti-corruption campaigns. Remember that the 2016 U.S. perpetrated anti-leftist coup in Brazil is what paved the way for Bolsonaro's victory in 2016, which it seems was also helped by CIA information warfare.
Yes.
So there's going to be all this violence perpetrated against the victims of empire around the globe, as well as the victims of empire at home. Because let's not forget that Biden plans to enact more austerity, and that part of Biden's police reform plan is to give the police departments $300 in additional $300 million in additional funds. We can see how well this kind of reform worked out during the Obama era, when Obama's White House defended aggressive militaristic actions by police and court, and Obama helped with the efforts to give police more military gear, excess military gear. As a result, police brutality didn't decrease during the Obama years. If anything, it increased, according to this 538 graph that I saw recently. These are the realities that will be swept under the rug by the cheery narrative of a healed America. And I'm interested in seeing how they'll try to sell this, because it sounds so corny on its face, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Was that it?
Yeah.
You done? Okay. I didn't want to step on your toes. Is that article that you were referring to called "The New McCarthyism for a New Cold War"?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Isn't that a coincidence? Because that's the next topic up on our list. Take it away.
I've learned that Biden's pick for Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who's apparently been involved in a bunch of shady capitalist stuff, plans to continue America's endless wars by, once again, sweeping them under the rug, by making them harder for the media to report upon, which builds on the trend in recent years that Trump has advanced of not publicly disclosing the numbers for drone casualties. I wonder what the likelihood is that Biden and Blinken will undo this. And Blinken plans to scale down or relocate some of America's troops in some areas, will engaging in special forces operations and proxy warfare in other areas. So no doubt they're going to continue the proxy war in Syria and in Ukraine, and they'll engage in all sorts of meddling and destabilization worldwide. I wonder what their next step will be in Thailand if their color revolution attempt there doesn't succeed. And while all of this is happening, like I said, they're going to ramp up aggressions against North Korea and try to further militarily encircle the DPRK. So to manufacture consent for all this, as well as the continued Cold War escalations against Russia and China, they're going to need to conceal their imperialist machinations to the public, and better yet, get the public to be on board with their moves towards war. And they can do this by tightening censorship. This is actually something that one of the top people in Biden's team has advocated for. I forget his name, but the Gray Zone has reported on how I think he's involved in Biden's transition team, and this shady dude has advocated for the U.S. to use propaganda against its own population and to reconsider parts of the First Amendment. So censorship will be high on the Biden administration's list of priorities. They plan to continue the intensification of censorship that's been going on throughout the Russiagate era. And they'll probably retrofit Russiagate for whatever machinations they try to carry out in the future. And of course, the Republican campaign to paint Biden as a Chinese puppet will factor into kind of reverse Russiagate, that with, of course, all the same perilous consequences. All of this will tie into the establishment of a new McCarthyism that's born out of decades of American anti-communist indoctrination. The indoctrination towards pro-imperialist ideology in America starts at a young age for people who were born in this country. It's really drilled into us, because the default things that we learn about China and North Korea in particular are really boogeyman narratives. They're narratives that portray China as a sinister dictatorship that committed a terrible atrocity in Tiananmen Square in 1989. They're narratives that portray Kim Jong-un as a sinister dictator who oppresses his people and is the only one who's responsible for these nuclear escalations, even though this couldn't be further from the truth. These are the narratives that are drilled into people's heads, and the job of these imperialist propagandists is both to inflame this sense of anti-communist hostility and to censor journalists and media outlets which seek to dispel these disgusting lies. The Gray Zone, I'm sure, will experience plenty of censorship and sabotage in the coming years, along with Venezuela analysis and probably antiwar.com, Caitlin Johnstone, Main Press News, you name it.
Yeah. This article that you've presented to us is it's really a further revelation for us in the methods and how the Biden regime intends to extend and expand the creeping stealth fascism that has been slowly wrapping its tentacles around all aspects of American life. So you're doing us a good deed here in helping us to put more meat on this animal, put more meat, flesh, bones onto what this animal is going to look like, so that we can begin to fight back, so that we can combat this particular form of evil, which is bipartisan, obviously, because Trump has been doing this all along in his administration, his regime, and it looks like Biden will simply be picking up right where Trump left off. They'll have some superficial differences in between those two regimes, but the differences are all for show. they're not real differences. The aim is the same on both sides. They're like two jumping, yapping dogs trying to curry favor with the master. That's all these Democrats and Republicans are. And of course, the master in this case is the billionaires, the capitalist ruling class. So, job well done. Another job well done. And then we have another one beyond that that is titled The Ideological Purpose of Anti-Chinese Propaganda by Rainer Shea.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Like I said, the sense of hatred towards China and the DPRK in particular are deeply ingrained into the American psyche. It's the same as probably the case in peripheral imperialist countries like the UK and Australia, which are not by coincidence two of the countries that are most on board with the new Cold War against China. In this article, I start off by assessing the countries that appear to be most on board with this Cold War effort against China, in addition to the United States. These countries are UK, Australia, India, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, which even though some of these countries have lately been engaging with more trade with China, they can nonetheless be brought into the fold of the U.S. NATO political hegemony through the project of NATO 2030, which seeks to expand NATO into the Pacific U.S. allies and therefore bring these Pacific allies into the political jurisdiction of these U.S. NATO oligarchs. So this is the solution that the technocrats have for the rise of the multipolar world that's going to be primarily led by China. Their solution is to isolate their closest allies away from Russia and China so that they'll continue to function as satellite states for the United States. And part of the agenda for carrying out this goal of imperialist isolationism is to get the populations of these countries to hate China in particular. I've recently been seeing material from Indian right-wingers that perfectly mirrors the xenophobia of right-wingers in places like the US and Australia. Stuff like boycott China and other stuff that's demonizing the Communist Party of China. Whether it's in India, or Australia, or the UK, or the US, it all serves the same function, to get the populations on board with increasing war escalations, and this is so essential to their imperialist cause, because so much of the world, apart from these loyal U.S. satellite states, are pragmatically aligning with China economically. It's really a practical necessity now to align with China, since the U.S. is a perpetually sinking ship, and China is seemingly the only country whose economy has grown in this last year. It's really incredible how Chinese living standards and GDP have grown in the last year, apart from this incredibly brief bump in the road after COVID-19 was at its worst in China earlier this year, which is, of course, thanks to the Chinese socialist model for combating pandemics. So superior to what we have in the US. But all of these details need to be deflected and obfuscated through a perpetual effort to project the US empire's crimes onto China. Well, countries like the US and France keep passing these fascistic laws that persecute Muslims and other minorities, and political dissent in these countries is increasingly repressed. I mean, recently the UK got close to passing essentially a Gestapo law that would allow state-sanctioned murder and rape by UK police. The empire has continued to demonize China as a threat to democracy. This is the line that's being pushed, that China is a threat to global democracy. And as far as bourgeois democracy goes, yes, China is a threat to democracy, because China represents an example for the masses to follow in all of these countries. Of course, China doesn't have the goal of exporting revolutions worldwide. It doesn't militarily intervene or try to actively sow discord within these countries. But the very fact that China is socialist and is rising is apparently seen as a grave threat by these Cold War years, because if journalists like Danny Haifeng are able to help spread the message that Chinese socialism is working, then the masses are going to start to catch on. They're going to start looking into the Marxist ideology that China and the other existing socialist states uphold.
Yeah. India is a real interesting case, isn't it? Modi, who is the Prime Minister of India, he doesn't get as much attention as Trump and Bolsonaro of Brazil and Bojo in the UK. But he's cut from the same cloth. He's a right wing, in my opinion, actually a fascist, just like those others are actually fascists. But it's a new kind of fascism, which you did a really good job of explaining some of the methodology of this new type of fascism when you were talking about new McCarthyism for a new Cold War and the Biden regime, the new Biden regime coming in on January 20th. And Modi fits in that same mold. Right from the get-go, as soon as he was elected, he began doing the same kind of stuff that Trump does against immigrants. He was doing against Muslims, because Muslims are a minority in India. There are only about 300 million of them in India. So they're considered a minority because they're far, far overwhelmed by all the Hindus in India. And yeah, he plays the same fascistic game as Trump plays of subtly and stealthily using racist hatreds to divide people and to go after minorities, oppressed minorities within India, just as Trump does against oppressed minorities in the United States. And of course, the Democrats do exactly the same. They play the same game, but they're more subtle and more effective than the idiots like Trump and Modi are. Trump and Modi are way too blatant and up in your face for their own good. So they engender a lot of hatred because of that, of people who righteously, justifiably hate them because they're such vile, fascistic racists. Anyway, yeah, job well done. That was the ideological purpose of anti-Chinese propaganda, something that we need to be paying a lot of attention to, and that we already have been paying a lot of attention to on this show in the past couple of years at least. So anything more you want to add before we move on?
Just that Daini Haifang is a prime example of the kind of truth teller who they're trying to push out by any means necessary, whether it's propaganda, stigmatization, censorship. People like Danny are one of the biggest ideological enemies to the U.S. ruling class.
I'm sure that they're going to be going after Black Agenda Report, because everybody on Black Agenda Report, they're all the same kinds of people, same truth tellers, as you correctly call them. Okay, next on the agenda, topic number 7, G20, the debt solution. And this is an article that comes from Michael Roberts' blog, which I've mentioned often. I've mentioned him a couple of times earlier in this show. And his most recent article or blog, he likes to call it a blog, I guess, but it's the Michael Roberts blog on the next recession, all one word, .wordpress.com. You can find it. It'll be pretty much right up on front in the list of blog articles. G20, the debt solution. And what he's talking about here is debt is enormous worldwide, in the United States and worldwide. Huge debts have been accrued, especially in these last 3 or 4 years, or for that matter, in the last decade, during the long depression, which is what Michael Roberts rightfully calls our economic circumstance over the last decade. A lot of people call it the Great Recession, but things are a lot worse than the government liars, professional liars would have you believe. And anyway, especially when COVID-19 came along, and at a couple of months earlier when the Greatest Depression hit us, the response by government has been a desperate act of quantitative easing on steroids. And of course, quantitative easing is the central banks generating money out of nothing. It's get your money for nothing and your chicks for free, I guess, as the song goes. But it's a way. What they do is the central bank. In our case, it's our central bank is called the Fed, or the Federal Reserve System, and the Federal Reserve System creates new credit that they give to banks, and this credit that the Fed gives to the banks gives the banks the ability to make huge loans to big business all over. And it's a way to shower money. It's like creating money out of the ether. It's a way to shower money down on the billionaire class, down on the Fortune 500, down on big business, down on the big banks. And they've done this a lot, especially over the last several months during COVID-19. They've literally created trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of new credit out of nothing. It's not based on any real wealth, and yet it turns into spendable money when these entities take these loans out that are created by the Fed in their huge quantitative easing activities. What it's led to is huge debt all around the world, and a lot of economists recently are paying a lot of attention to this. It's this fiscal and monetary stimulus. The economists are real worried about it. Number one, because this naturally creates inflation, because it devalues the value of the currency. And in our case, it's called the dollar. Devalues the dollar, which means that workers bringing their paychecks home can only buy less and less and less money with the same, less and less goods with the same amount of money. So it creates huge inflation, which causes huge problems on its own. And this has caused, around the world, it's caused a slew of nations to declare bankruptcy. Zambia this week was the most recent to declare default or restructured debts in 2020, and more are expected in the coming months as there's no quick end to COVID-19. And so there's been a lot. For instance, at last week's annual G20 meeting, there was a lot of discussion. What should we do about this huge debt? And some people are calling for a debt moratorium. The G20 already extended a debt moratorium for several months. That basically the debtor nations didn't have to pay back their loans on the short term, but they would end up having to pay all that money back. It was just a postponed payment. Let's say it's kicking the can down the road. We know about that because that's what Trump did with the foreclosures in the United States. There were 50, 60 million Americans threatened with being kicked out of their homes because they couldn't pay their rent or couldn't pay their mortgage. And Trump extended this moratorium on rent and mortgage payment through to January 1st. So then the bill comes due. They got to pay it then. Anyway, that's a similar kind of thing with what this debt moratorium did, that the G20 extended starting in April in response to the COVID-19 plague, or they call it a pandemic. I think plague is a better, more accurate description. Anyway, so that's one thing that some of the G20 nations are advocating. Other G20 nations are advocating a jubilee, a debt jubilee, where you just write off debts, which is what China, by the way, has done with several poverty-stricken African countries that are just unable to pay their debts to Chinese banks and to the China. They've just written the loans off. They've told the people, okay, just start from scratch and, we'll go from here, which is what they should do with all this debt, and just wipe the whole thing clean. Capitalists don't like that because it puts them in the situation where they end up paying the bill. In my opinion, that is the most fair way to do it, because capitalists did not create any of the wealth that they have. Capitalists stole all that wealth, as Marx proves in Das Kapital and Capital Volumes 1, 2, and 3. It's theft, pure and simple. They rob us of the value that we create, the surplus value that we create. They rob it from us. So should they have to pay this bit more cost in their doing business from all the predatory loans that they've given out to third world countries and using it to exploit these third world countries? I say, fuck yes. That's my personal opinion. I think a lot of people agree with me. So there's that. That's something that we're really going to have to fight for, because it's unlikely that these bourgeois governments are going to agree to that. And it's mostly the bourgeois governments that are holding these huge loans, like what's that, Democrates sword or whatever, holding the sword above the guy. It's like that. So then they discussed that way of doing things. Michael Roberts concludes in this article that it's pretty likely that what they're going to do is simply kind of try to muddle through this debt crisis that's building and building, and through the short-term trick of kicking the can down the road of debt repayment moratorium, and just refusing to really deal with it in any way. They'll just hope that it goes away. A lot of them are talking about how what we really need is just promote world growth. But the problem is, when you have this huge debt burden, it plays the role in the economy of constituting a huge drag on the economy. So you're not going to get growth in that kind of environment. I mean, you look at China. China has a more reasonable, rational way of dealing with debt. And yet China's, as you mentioned earlier, is one of the few economies in the world that's gone quickly back, snapped quickly back to growth. So that's it.
Right, right. You look at these contradictions of capitalism, you look at these problems that capitalism creates for itself, and you can see how groups like the libertarians are able to gain traction for their ideas by looking at these problems of capitalism and saying, this is the solution. We need to abolish all social programs and do something like anarcho-capitalism. But it's just more BS. It's more of the same, more of the same system that that got us into this place. You can't use capitalism to solve the problems of capitalism. As much as the social democrats, like I said, try to make us believe this, the contradictions are still going to be there. And it'll be interesting to see how these technocrats, how these oligarchs of the U.S. Global capitalist order will deal with this issue. I mean, either way, there's going to be more global austerity. This is something that the IMF is already working towards in 81 countries. They're getting 81 countries to carry out more austerity, privatization, and lowering of wages. Yeah. This is what's going to continue to be the trend, as has been the case since the economic crisis of the 70s. The burdens of the crisis will be pushed onto the backs of the poor and to the middle class, who increasingly become the poor.
That's what happens, isn't it? Okay. Well, we've got one more topic coming up. However, Rainer and I are going to be saying goodbye to you right now, because this topic is, we pre-prepared it as a slideshow, so we'll just be tacking that on the end of the show. So you viewers at home, you'll see it. And in the meantime, I want to thank everybody for joining us on the show. Thank you, Rainer, for the huge contributions that you always make and that you made tonight. And look forward to speaking with everybody again next week. So
yes.
long, Rainer.
So long.
Okay. I'm going to present some interesting facts on the U.S. economy, and this is a comparison to the Chinese economy in 2020 and in 1980. It's quite illuminating. This is from thenextrecession.wordpress.com. The article is entitled "The U.S. Economy, Some Facts." First up on the list, I want to, well, here, let's put this into full mode so you can see it better. This is the GDP, the share of world GDP as it looked in 1980. As you can see, the USA was number one. They are number one in some things. Back in 1980, they were the largest GDP in the world with 26.53% of the world GDP. Japan came next with 10%, quite a drop. And if we go way down here, number 12 at 1.77, we can see China. That was then. Here in 1919, just a year ago, pre-COVID, and this is also pre the Greatest Depression, which started in the last quarter of 2019, according to the United States government. Although the U.S. government claims that this is a COVID-19 forced recession, not a depression. And it's just kind of funny that it started in the last quarter, that is the last 3 months of 2019. And as everyone knows by now, there were only 1 or 2 cases, mainly towards the middle of that quarter of COVID-19. That's when we saw the first outbreaks. Of course, the first outbreaks were in Italy and in California, despite the lies that the American president has been telling you about the Chinese virus. So here in 2019, the U.S. has 0.14%, which is still significant. Yeah, as you can see, it's the largest portion of the world GDP in the world. China has 16.34%, which is quite a huge leap from the 1.7% that it had in 1980. So China's grown tremendously. Japan's fallen tremendously to only 5.83%. Germany comes next with 4.6%, UK 3.3%, France 3.2%, India 3.1%, actually 3.2%, Italy 2.45%, might as well say 2.5%, Brazil 2.22%, and Canada 2.02%. That U.S., as Michael Roberts points out, the U.S. still has the largest in constant dollar terms, although the share has declined. The U.S. share is larger than the rest of the G7 combined. But China has rocketed to over 16%, leaving India in its tracks. As we can see here, India has 3.19%. India and China are the 2 largest nations by population in the world, so both quite significant potential markets. China has done a lot more with its socialist market system to exploit, to develop that internal market as well as its export market. Okay, next on the list, U.S. Real GDP per person growth rate has averaged less than 3% a year and has been slowing constantly, while China has averaged around 3 times as much. As we can see, this is from 1980 to 2019. This is before the greatest depression, as I call it, and as many others are calling it, but before the economic downturn began in the last quarter of 2019, according to U.S. figures. I think it actually started prior to that, but that's when the U.S. government first recognizes it. And of course, initially they had said that it started in February of 2020, the month before the COVID-19 pandemic was declared worldwide. And really the month before it started clobbering the US economy. The economy was already in a crash, already in a downturn. So as you can see, China now is around 6% growth rate. The US, it's hidden here unfortunately, but the US's growth rate is about 4.6%, 4.5% per capita annual growth rate. So quite a bit more tepid. And the US growth rates, as you can see, have fallen pretty close to around 4%. This is, okay, the next, share of world manufacturing output. At the start of 1980s, the US manufacturing had more than 25% of the world output, with Japan at 11% and Germany at 7%. China was nowhere. By 2017, the US share had slipped to about 18%, with both Japan and Germany below 10%. China had rocketed to over 25%. Now look at this in 2018, and it's more now because the United States keeps slipping, but in 2018, US had 18% of the world manufacturing output, where China had 25%. You can see it in this chart. There's the Chinese line is the dotted red. China really started taking off in 2004, as you can see, and has rocketed way above the US in manufacturing output. It's not so much that the US has declined all that much, although it has declined quite a bit. The actual manufacturing in the United States has not significantly declined. What has happened, though, is it has lost its global share of manufacturing output because of the phenomenal manufacturing output of China, as China grew so tremendously, with tremendous growth rates over the last 40 years since they began their reforms, changing from a Stalinist style collectivized economy to a more open to the global economy, market socialist economy, a mixed market socialist economy, what I like to call an NEP economy, because the first person to implement this on a wide scale was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in 1921 in the Soviet Union. Actually, it wasn't even called the Soviet Union back then, because it wasn't called that until 1922. But in, you know what I mean, in the in socialist Russia, revolutionary Bolshevik Russia, the NEP, which was a mixed market socialist economy, was launched. And it was quite phenomenal in Russia at that time, and in the other parts of the Soviet Union as well. I mean, they had growth rates that were phenomenal during the 1920s of like 16, 17%. So it's the best possible system, given the reality of a global market dominated by capitalist imperialism. It's the best kind of response to that by a socialist workers' state. So share of world exports. The U.S. share of world exports in 1980 was over 13%, with Germany and Japan well behind. China was only at 1%. Hopefully you can see here, U.S. at 13.41%, Germany at 9.83%. This is the U.S. share of world exports. China was way down here in 1980 at 1.19% of the world exports. So you can see China was well behind the U.S. at 13.41%. In 2019, China overtook the U.S. with nearly an 11% share, while the U.S. share slipped to 10%. China at 10.86 there, round off to 11, and U.S. at 10.27%. And of course, that was last year. This year, we're going to find that China is well above. Has probably added a point or two, and the U.S. has probably lost a point or two. So life expectancy, another big interesting thing. In China, in 1980, the U.S. was 21st in the world with life expectancy at birth at 73.6 years, behind most European countries, and even Cuba. Little poverty-stricken Cuba was ahead of the United States. We can see the United States down here at 73.61 years of life expectancy, Cuba at 73.79. So even poverty-stricken China, that's been oppressed by 50, 55, 58, whatever it is, 60 years of U.S. Economic embargo. Way up here, we had Iceland. Iceland's supposedly a pretty nice place to live. It's kind of austere, but if you like that kind of thing, cold. 76.85 years. Japan, 76.009. Netherlands, 75.74. So we can see mostly the social democratic countries. And I think back then, Japan had a much more social democratic regime than it does now, with Abe, who's a far right winger like Trump. So you can see it's mostly the social democratic European countries. Iceland, of course, is in North America. It's on the North American tectonic plate, in other words, even though it seems to be out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's part of the North American tectonic plate, but it's considered culturally and economically part of Europe. Those social democratic countries were winning out in 1980, but of course, social democracy has suffered huge rollbacks since then. By 2019, the U.S. had dropped to 43 in the rankings with 78.5 years, and China was catching up with 76.7 years. So you can see U.S. at 43, pretty bad, really. Although 76, that's not a bad run. That's 10 years away from me, so we'll see. Yeah, I mean, the countries, the Americans are sharing this dubious title with, like, Albania, Panama, Estonia, Croatia, Emirates, Uruguay, Oman, Poland, Turkey. Yeah, a lot of the worst of the worst. Well, anyway. Inequity in income and wealth, of the G7 economies, the U.S. has the most unequal distribution of both personal wealth and incomes, as we can see here. This is by the Gini index, which is a way to measure wealth and income inequality, and basically quality of life. The United States is pretty bad at 85% on the Gini index of inequality and unequal distribution of personal wealth and incomes. So this blue line is for wealth, and the what is that? Orange line is for income. So by wealth, you can see the rich are tremendously rich, and the rest of us are relatively poor in the United States, Germany, United Kingdom, Japan, way down here at 60, which is still not great. All of the G7 countries are pretty unequal, but the United States is the king of inequality for sure. Military expenditures, we all know this story. The U.S. spends 3 times as much on military expenditure as China, and more than the rest of the world put together. You can see there. Carbon emissions per head is another one. U.S. tops the bill with more carbon emissions per capita at 16.5%. Australia and Canada come next, mainly because they're big energy producers. Netherlands is up there. Japan. China's down 7.5, which is half as much as the United States. So, yeah, and United Kingdom is hovering not too much lower than the U.S. Countries that come in real good are like India at 1.7%. Mainly that's due to the incredible poverty in India and the lack of development. Brazil comes in at 2.6%, Sweden at 4.5%, so we can see some of that. Homicide rate, of course, we know the United States is terrible on this. United States overall, per 100,000 of population, 5.2 murders. Canada is 1.5. Interesting statistic, per capita, the same number of households in Canada own guns as in the United States. So there must be something else besides just owning guns. It really has to do with attitude. It has to do with culture. Canada's culture is not an imperialist culture, even though its government is highly imperialist and highly integrated with the American imperialist system. We can see some of the other countries out here, countries that have different attitudes towards murder, and they have different attitudes towards militarism and at least flashy shows of militarism, and towards aggressive imperialist wars, although some of these are aggressively imperialist, like the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has banned all guns, basically. And most of these other countries have done the same thing. So keeping guns out of people's hands does make a difference, although you look at Switzerland, 0.7. In Switzerland, all males of military age, I think between 18 and 35, are required to keep a combat fully automatic rifle in their homes. So you can see, even when they have loads of guns, which Switzerland people do, the males and a lot of the females who volunteer to join Switzerland's militias. They have lots of guns, but they have an attitude that's not an imperialist attitude. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed it, and that gives us an idea of where things are at, comparatively speaking, in the economy.